A hidden lake, a mysterious figure, and dark red liquid pouring into the water. Followed home and broken into at 2 a.m. Watch the chilling tale, if you dare. There's a hidden lake a short walk from my house in Parsonfield, Maine. I've been fishing there for as long as I've lived here. It's hidden away from any roads or houses, offering perfect privacy. I would always be the only one out on the lake fishing. I even leave my kayak there to avoid lugging it back and forth. One warm summer evening, I was out on the lake for about an hour and had caught a few trout. It was dusk and the last bit of light was disappearing behind the trees. I was about to head in when I heard sounds from the edge of the lake. I turned and saw someone standing at the water's edge, tipping a barrel and pouring its contents into the lake. It looked like they were polluting the water. I shouted, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The person looked at me and then ran into the woods, leaving the barrel's contents still pouring into the water. It looked like a dark red liquid, but it was too dark to be sure. Unease crept over me, and I decided to leave. I'm a big nature guy, and seeing someone pollute the environment made me sick, but I didn't feel comfortable there any longer. I planned to report this to the Department of Environmental Protection. I pedaled my kayak back to my usual spot, took all my gear off the kayak, and pulled it out of the water. As I was covering the kayak, I heard a single snap, like something under a person's shoe. I was about to say, "Who's there?" but decided against it. I quickly finished covering the kayak, left it on the ground, picked up my gear and cooler, and started walking quickly out of the woods to the road leading to my house. It was only a couple of minutes' walk, but I kept looking over my shoulder, thinking someone was behind me. I put my gear in the shed and went inside, locking the door quickly. I was genuinely spooked. I rinsed off the trout and put them in the fridge, planning to cook them tomorrow. Tonight I just heated up some leftovers. As the food was in the microwave, there was a knock at my front door. The fear and dread I felt walking back to the house returned instantly. Who else would be knocking on my door this late? My lights were on, and my car was in the driveway. Whoever it was knew I was inside. I had all the shades closed so nobody could look inside. They knocked on the door again. The microwave beeped as the timer hit 0. I'm sure whoever was outside heard it. A moment later, there was a knock on the window and a man's voice said, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I'd like to explain myself." There was no chance I was opening the door. The fact that they stalked me home told me this was a dangerous person. They repeatedly knocked on the window and kept yelling, "Hello?" I decided to acknowledge him. "Yo, leave or I'll call the police," I yelled. I intended to call them anyway, but it was still a threat to make him leave. The man responded calmly, "Sir, if you could just open the front door, I'll explain everything to you." I repeated my threat, and I didn't hear his voice again. I locked every window in the house and turned on the AC. I also made a report to the non-emergency police number about the barrel and the man coming to my house. I made an online report with the Department of Environmental Protection too. These reports made me feel a bit better about sleeping that night. Thank God I'm a light sleeper. Around 2 a.m. I heard a crash from downstairs. I sprang out of bed and grabbed my Glock from the closet. I heard quiet footsteps coming up the creaky wooden steps. I stood behind my dresser, aiming at the door. The footsteps approached my door. The doorknob slowly pressed down, and the door pushed open. I saw the man's silhouette. I flicked on the lamp so he could see my gun and screamed, "Get on the ground now." He raised his hands and motioned for me to calm down. He had a small blade in his hand. I told him to drop it, but he said calmly, "I'm leaving," and ran downstairs. I yelled for him to stop, but he took the chance that I wouldn't pull the trigger. I heard him leave through the front door. I ran downstairs, locked the door, and called 911. The living room window was shattered, with glass all over the floor. I watched the broken window until the police arrived. I explained that I had already made a non-emergency report earlier. I went with 2 officers to the lake, but after 20 minutes of searching, the barrel was gone. The man must have taken it. I gave the police the best description I could. A short, bearded white man with a receding hairline and glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and black pants. After the police left, I stayed in the living room with my gun, watching TV. No way was I going to sleep with a broken window and a nut job out there. At dawn, my brothers came over to help fix the window. My brother Dale stayed at the house while my other brother and I went to Home Depot for supplies. Dale stayed with me for a few nights until things cooled down. My theory is that the barrel contained human remains, possibly dissolved in some kind of acid. Why else would that man follow me home and break into my house? Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If I had opened the door to that man, something terrible might have happened to me. Ever since I was a kid, the older men in my family would take me fishing every chance they got. It was like a family ritual. Being the youngest, I was next in line to become an expert like all of them claimed to be. The ones who took it the most seriously were my dad and his brother, Matthew. Our houses looked like something from a fishing show. You'd instantly know my parents spent more time on the water than on land. This is actually my dad's story, not mine. My dad, John, is a pretty tough guy to scare. But whenever he tells this story, he becomes a different person. He doesn't like talking about it, but sometimes at family gatherings, someone will ask him to tell it, and he will. My dad was fishing with my uncle Matthew and their friends Rich, Jeff, and Monty. They set out early before the sun was up, heading to a remote spot they all agreed was prime fishing territory. This place was a couple of hours boat ride from the nearest marina, tucked away in a secluded cove that few bothered to explore. It was known among them for its abundant bass and occasional pike. The day started like any other fishing trip, with the boat cutting smoothly through the mist rising off the water. They anchored the boat in a familiar cove surrounded by dense forest. Monty was the first to crack open a beer, even though it was early in the morning. My dad always says Monty is his wild friend, the one who drinks a little more than he should. They fished for hours, the only sounds being the splash of lures hitting the water and their laughter, along with the crunch of empty beer cans. As dusk approached, a dense fog rolled in from the water. My dad describes it as the boat being swallowed by fog. Rich, the most experienced fisherman, kept saying he had never seen fog so thick. Jeff, the joker of the group, was almost as drunk as Monty and seemed unfazed by the fog. It was getting dark, and they thought they could just wait out the fog, but it didn't seem to be going anywhere. My dad and Rich agreed that Matthew should try to drive the boat out of the cove and into the open ocean where the fog might not be as dense. Matthew agreed, but narrowly avoided colliding with the shore. He refused to risk further damage to his prized boat. They reluctantly accepted that they'd probably have to spend the night on the boat. My dad pointed out that they needed to tell their families about the situation, but they had drifted into an area with no signal. My dad had work obligations, so ignoring the problem wasn't an option. He offered to go ashore to search for a signal, and Rich and Jeff joined him. Matthew stayed back to guard the boat and a now very drunk Monty. My dad, Jeff, and Rich made their way to the shore, only getting slightly wet. My dad grabbed the emergency flares from the boat just in case. They made their way into the pitch-black woods, lit only by their phone flashlights. They had all done their fair share of camping, so the forest didn't scare them too much. They began trekking uphill, hoping higher ground would give them a better chance of finding a signal. My dad always emphasizes how dark and foggy the forest was. You could practically feel yourself slicing through the fog. Just as they were adjusting to the dense atmosphere, strange clicking noises began to permeate the silence. First in front of them, then encircling them completely. These sounds were unlike any forest sounds they knew. It was rhythmic, yet erratic, like someone was tapping out a code meant only for the woods. The realization that they weren't alone hit them like a freight train. Rich, the most seasoned in outdoor survival, urgently whispered for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed with genuine concern. As the light switched off, the darkness became thicker than the fog. The clicking noises stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that seemed to weigh on their chests. Time lost meaning as they stood, frozen, unsure of their next move. They were all thinking the same thing. They might have stumbled upon some kind of clandestine gathering or woods cult. Suddenly, the silence was broken by rustling noises, this time much closer, then silence again, followed by a guttural scream that echoed through the trees. It was a primal, anguished sound that rooted them to the spot. Before they could process what was happening, rapid stomping noises thundered through the woods toward them. The three men took off, running back the way they came, acting on pure fear and instinct. My dad fired the flare gun behind them, and the flare cut through the fog, lighting the woods up for a moment. The sight was horrifying. Illuminated by the flare's red glow was a pack of more than 10 individuals dressed in what looked like tribal attire, some brandishing wooden spears. The flare's light only lasted a split second. Jeff screamed and almost stumbled, but Rich quickly grabbed his arm to keep him upright. My dad describes this part as the most overwhelming feeling of pure terror he has ever experienced. The forest seemed to fight against them as they fled, ducking under branches and jumping over roots. By some miracle, they emerged from the tree line, panting and disoriented, but alive. They screamed at Matthew to start the engine. The urgency in their voices left no room for questions. Matthew complied immediately, and the boat lurched forward just as their pursuers reached the shoreline. In the chaos, my dad fired the last flare into the air towards the shore. For a split second, as the flare's light pierced the fog, they saw their pursuers at the water's edge. It was freakish. There must have been at least 15 of them standing motionless at the water's edge. The flare's light faded, and it was dark again. Matthew managed to get a safe distance away and stopped the boat. After the engine was off, the only sounds were Jeff, my dad, and Rich's breathing. My dad says he couldn't process what had happened for nearly an hour. He was functioning on pure adrenaline and survival instincts. They took turns keeping watch while the others slept and left first thing in the morning as soon as the fog dissipated. Funnily enough, Monty had passed out before everything happened and doesn't remember any details of that night. I still get shivers down my spine when I tell this story. I can only imagine what my dad feels when he thinks back to it.